The grand hall of the Musikverein in Vienna shimmered under crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged wine, and the quiet hum of people who mattered. It was the closing night of the International Piano Festival, and the guest of honor was a man the world called a living legend. He'd played Carnegie Hall at 20, recorded with orchestras in Berlin and Tokyo, and once received a standing ovation that lasted 17 minutes. Tonight, though, he wasn't performing. He was hosting a private reception for donors, critics, and fellow musicians, all gathered to toast his latest triumph. In the corner, far from the laughter and clinking glasses, a woman moved quietly between tables, adjusting flower arrangements and straightening silverware. She wore a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her hands steady despite the weight of the evening. To the guests, she was invisible, just part of the background like the velvet curtains or the polished floor. But she noticed everything, the way the maestro's eyes lit up when someone mentioned his childhood teacher, the nervous intern spilling champagne on a famous conductor's sleeve, the quiet pride in an elderly patron's voice as she recalled hearing Beethoven's Emperor live in 1958. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. 10 years ago, she'd walked these same halls as a student at the Vienna Conservatory, the youngest in her class, praised for her rare sensitivity and fearless interpretation. Teachers said she'd be the next great voice of her generation. She practiced 10 hours a day, fueled by dreams and strong coffee, her fingers dancing over etudes like they were breathing. But then her mother fell ill, suddenly, severely. The diagnosis was grim, the treatments endless. She dropped out overnight, sold her keyboard, took whatever work she could find, ushering at concerts, filing paperwork for arts nonprofits, coordinating small events like this one. The piano became a luxury she couldn't afford, not in time, not in money, not in heart. Still, she never stopped listening. She'd hum melodies while folding programs, tap rhythms on bus windows, imagine concert halls in the echo of subway tunnels. Music never left her. It just went quiet like a song on pause. Now she worked these events not for the glamour but because being near music, even as a spectator, kept something alive inside her. She never touched the instruments, never asked to sit in on rehearsals. She just watched, listened, and remembered. Tonight, though, felt different. The legendary pianist, charismatic, sharp-eyed, always in control, moved through the crowd like a king among subjects. He told stories, made people laugh, accepted praise with a charming shrug. But she saw the tired lines around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them. She knew that look. It was the face of someone who'd given everything to his art and wasn't sure what was left. At one point, he glanced her way, not with recognition, she was just staff, but with the casual curiosity one gives a passing shadow. Then he turned back to his guests, raised his glass, and said something that made them laugh loudly. She kept working, head down, heart steady. But fate has a way of interrupting even the quietest lives. Later, as she refilled water glasses near the grand piano, a magnificent Bösendorfer, polished to a mirror shine, he spotted her again. This time he gestured toward her with his wine glass. "Hey, you, the one with the quiet hands," he called out, voice warm but edged with playful challenge. "Come here a moment." She froze. Every eye turned toward her. Heat rushed to her cheeks, but she walked forward slowly, head high, hands clasped in front of her. He smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. "My friends here were just saying real musical genius is vanishing. All flash, no soul." He winked. "So I told them. Maybe it's hiding in plain sight." A few guests chuckled. One said, "Oh, here we go." He turned to her. "Go on, love, play us something. If you can make this old Bösendorfer sing, I'll personally sponsor your debut right here at the Musikverein." The room erupted in laughter. It was clearly a joke, a rich man's punchline, a way to lighten the mood. Someone whistled. Another said, "Better start practicing your curtain call." She didn't flinch. She just looked at him, really looked, and in that moment, she saw not mockery, but something deeper. Boredom, maybe, or the restless hunger of someone who'd heard every polished performance and longed for something real. She didn't speak. She simply walked past him, toward the piano. The laughter died down, replaced by curious murmurs. She sat on the bench, took a breath, and then without fanfare, without hesitation, she placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang out, clear, resonant, alive. And just like that, the joke was over. The first note hung in the air like a held breath, clear, deep, and full of something no one in the room could name. Then came the second and the third, and soon the opening phrases of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 unfolded not as a performance, but as a confession. Her hands moved with a kind of quiet certainty, as if they'd been waiting years for this moment. The music wasn't flashy. It wasn't showy. It was raw, aching with memory, layered with loss, yet somehow still hopeful. The laughter had already died. Glasses stopped clinking. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even the string quartet playing softly in the corner lowered their bows, as if the piano had claimed the room. At first, the legendary pianist stood with his arms crossed, a faint smirk still playing on his lips until the music reached the stormy middle section. That's when his expression changed. His shoulders tensed, his eyes narrowed not in judgment but in recognition. He'd heard thousands of pianists play this piece, but he'd never heard it sound like this, like someone was telling their whole life in a single song. She didn't play for them. She played for the memory of her mother humming lullabies in a hospital bed, for the years she'd spent practicing in cold apartments with broken heaters, fingers stiff but heart-burning, for the dreams she'd buried but never truly let go of. She played because for the first time in a decade, she felt permission to be herself. When the final chord faded, the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Then, from the back of the room, an elderly man in a rumpled suit stood slowly. He was a retired conductor, known for his brutal honesty and sharp ear. Without a word, he bowed deeply toward the piano, one by one. Others followed, some clapping softly, others wiping their eyes, a few simply staring at the floor, as if they'd just witnessed something too private to applaud. The legendary pianist didn't move. He just stood there, glass still in hand, face pale, eyes wide. For the first time in years, he had no clever remark, no witty comeback. He was speechless. She stood slowly, smoothing her dress, and walked toward the edge of the room. She didn't look at him, didn't smile. She just stepped back into the shadows like she was returning to her place in the world, but he blocked her path. His voice was low, rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "Who are you?" She met his eyes. "Just the event coordinator." "That wasn't just anything," he said, his tone sharper now, almost angry. "No one plays like that unless they've lived it. Unless they've lost something and found it again." She didn't answer right away. She glanced past him, at the glittering crowd, the chandeliers, the world that had never needed to wonder where their next meal was coming from. "People change," she said simply. "Sometimes life doesn't let you keep the things you love." He studied her face, the calm in her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. He'd spent his whole life reading musicians, spotting fakes, calculating talent. But with her, he saw nothing but truth, and that unsettled him more than any rival ever had. Before he could say more, his manager appeared, whispering something about a donor waiting to speak with him. He nodded stiffly, then turned back to her. "Don't leave tonight," he said. "I want to talk to you after the event." She didn't promise anything. She just gave a small nod and disappeared down the hall. The rest of the reception passed in a blur for him. He shook hands, smiled on cue, accepted praise for keeping the spirit of classical music alive. But his mind was elsewhere. Every time he heard piano music from the hired quartet, he flinched because it wasn't her sound. It wasn't real. Hours later, when the last guest had gone and the staff began cleaning up, he found her in the empty courtyard, sitting on a stone bench beneath a chestnut tree, its leaves rustling in the night breeze. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She just looked tired. He sat beside her, not too close. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For treating you like a punchline." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't know. That's no excuse." He ran a hand through his hair. "I've spent my life chasing perfection. But what you played tonight, it wasn't perfect. It was human. And that's rarer," she nodded. "Music isn't about getting every note right. It's about saying something true." He turned to her. "Why did you stop?" She looked down at her hands, calloused now from folding programs and carrying trays, not from hours on ivory keys. "My mother got sick. I had to work." There wasn't time for dreams. He didn't offer empty sympathy, didn't say "I'm sorry" like it was a reflex. Instead, he asked, "Do you miss it?" She smiled faintly. Every single day. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of the city and the soft rustle of leaves. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a legend. He just felt like a man who'd forgotten what music was really for. The next morning, she expected to be let go. After last night, things would be awkward. Too personal. Too strange. But instead, a note was slipped under her office door before sunrise. It read, "The practice hall on Berggasse is empty at 10 a.m. If you're willing, I'd like to hear you play again. No audience. No expectations." She stared at the paper for a long time. It wasn't a job offer. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was an invitation back into the light. She took it, and though neither of them knew it yet, that quiet morning in an empty hall would be the beginning of something neither fame nor fortune could buy. Something real. Something rare. Something that would leave everyone stunned all over again. The practice hall on Berggasse was small, unassuming, tucked between a bakery and a bookstore. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the beams like tiny notes suspended in air. The piano, a well-worn Yamaha upright, sat in the center, its lid open, keys slightly yellowed with age. It wasn't grand. It wasn't famous. But it was honest. She arrived 10 minutes early, heart pounding, hands tucked deep in her coat pockets. She hadn't played in front of anyone in 10 years. Not since the conservatory. Not since the accident that left her right hand weak for months. Not since she'd packed away her sheet music and told herself music was a luxury she could no longer afford. But here she was. He was already there, sitting on a folding chair near the window, a thermos of coffee in hand. He didn't stand when she entered, didn't offer a grand greeting. He just nodded like they were two people meeting for the first time. Not legend and staff, not performer and audience. "You came," he said. "I almost didn't. I'm glad you did." She walked to the piano, ran her fingers lightly over the keys. They felt familiar yet foreign, like an old friend you haven't seen in years. She sat, took a breath, and played a simple Bach prelude, just to test the waters to see if her hands still remembered. They did. Not perfectly. There was a slight tremor in her fourth finger, a hesitation in the left hand where the old injury still whispered its warning. But the music was there, clear, steady, alive. He listened without moving. When she finished, he didn't clap. He just said, "Play something harder." She chose Debussy's Clair de Lune. Slower than most, more spacious. She let the silences breathe, let the harmonies linger. This wasn't about speed or precision. It was about feeling. When the last note faded, he stood and walked to the piano. "You didn't just stop playing," he said quietly. "You stopped believing you were allowed to." She looked down. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" He leaned against the piano, arms crossed. "You think because you stepped away, you lost your right to return? Music doesn't work like that. It's not a club with a membership list. It's a home. And it's always waiting." She didn't answer, but something in her chest loosened just a little. Over the next few weeks, they met every Tuesday and Friday at 10. No audience. No recordings. Just two people and a piano. He didn't teach her. He didn't critique. He just played with her, sometimes duets, sometimes taking turns, sometimes sitting in silence while she worked through a difficult passage. He learned she still practiced at night, alone in her apartment, using a silent keyboard so she wouldn't disturb her neighbors. She learned he hadn't played for pleasure in years, only for concerts, only for critics, only for the next review. "I forgot what it felt like to play just because it hurts not to," he admitted one morning. One day he brought sheet music, Mozart's Sonata for two pianos. "We should try this," he said. She hesitated. "I haven't played with anyone since conservatory." "Then it's time." They started slowly, stumbling over entrances, missing cues. He laughed when he flubbed a run. She smiled when her hands finally found the rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was joyful. After that, their sessions changed. Less solo, more together. They played Schubert, Brahms, even a little Gershwin. He began to notice things. The way she shaped a phrase like a storyteller. How she'd hold a chord just a fraction longer to let it ache. "You don't just play notes," he said once. "You play the spaces between them." She started to believe him. Then came the invitation. A small, historic chapel on the outskirts of the city was hosting an intimate concert series. No press, no critics, just music lovers. He'd been asked to perform. Instead, he proposed a duet. "I want you to play with me," he said. She froze. "In public?" "Just 50 people. All friends of the chapel. No reviews. No recordings." She shook her head. "I'm not ready." "You've been ready for 10 years, he said gently. "You just needed someone to remind you." She didn't say yes right away. She went home, sat at her silent keyboard, and played the duet over and over in her mind. She thought about her mother, who'd sold her wedding ring to pay for her first piano lessons. She thought about the little girl she used to be who believed music could fix anything. The next morning, she texted him one word. "Okay." The week before the concert, they rehearsed daily. He was patient. She was determined. There were moments of frustration. Her hand would cramp, his tempo would rush, but they kept going. Not for perfection, for truth. The night of the concert, she arrived early, dressed in a simple dark dress, hair pulled back. The chapel was warm, lit by candlelight. The wooden pews filled with quiet anticipation. No cameras, no phones. Just people who loved music. He met her backstage, a small room with peeling paint and a single mirror. "Nervous?" he asked, terrified. "Good," he said. "That means you care." They walked on stage together. No introduction. No fanfare. Just two people sitting at two pianos under soft light. They began with Mozart, clean, bright, full of conversation. Then Schubert, tender, searching. And finally, a piece he'd arranged himself. A duet version of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The same one she'd played that first night at the Musikverein. This time, they played it together. His part was steady, grounding. Hers rose above it, clear and strong, like a voice finally free. They didn't play perfectly. He rushed a passage. She missed a chord, but they listened to each other, adjusted, stayed together. And in that imperfection, there was something more beautiful than any flawless performance. Trust. When the last note faded, the room didn't erupt in applause. They just sat in silence as if afraid to break the spell. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to stand. Not out of politeness. Out of reverence. Afterward, an elderly woman approached her, eyes glistening. "My husband used to play that nocturne for me every anniversary," she said softly. "Thank you for bringing him back to me tonight." She didn't know what to say. She just nodded, tears in her eyes. Later, as they walked out into the cool night air, he turned to her. "You see? You never really left." She looked up at the stars, then at him. "Maybe I just needed someone to believe I was still here." He smiled. "I don't just believe it. I hear it." And for the first time in a decade, she let herself believe it too. But peace never lasts long in a world that loves drama. Because while they were rebuilding something real, someone else was digging into her past, and what they found would threaten to tear it all apart before it even had a chance to grow. The days after the chapel concert settled into something fragile but real. She didn't wake up famous. No reporters camped outside her apartment. No record labels called. But something had shifted, not in the world, but in her. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch when she passed a piano in a shop window. She didn't change the channel when classical music came on the radio. She even started playing her old upright again at home, not on the silent keyboard but with the lid open, letting the sound fill her small apartment like it belonged there. He, in turn, had changed too. He canceled 2 high-profile concerts citing personal reflection. His manager was furious. Critics whispered he was losing his edge, but he didn't care. He'd spent decades chasing perfection, applause, legacy, and for the first time, he felt like he was making music again, not just performing it. Their Tuesday and Friday sessions continued. But now they weren't just about playing. They were about talking, about the pressure of being called a prodigy at 15, about the loneliness of life on tour, about how easy it is to forget why you started when everyone only cares about how you finish. One rainy afternoon, as they worked through a tricky passage in a Brahms intermezzo, he asked, "Why did you really leave the conservatory? It wasn't just your mother, was it?" She paused, hands resting on the keys. "There was a mentor, a professor. He pushed me harder than anyone. Said greatness required sacrifice. I practiced until my hands bled. When the injury came, he told me I'd failed, that I didn't have what it took. He was quiet for a long time, And you believed him. I had no one else telling me different. He looked at her then, not as a fellow musician, but as someone who understood the weight of expectation. You know, I once played Carnegie Hall with a fever of 103 collapsed backstage. They called it dedication. I called it fear. Fear of what? Of not being enough, she nodded. I know that fear. They sat in silence for a while, the rain tapping gently against the windows. Then he said, "What if we did something bigger? Not a concert. Something meaningful," she frowned. Like what? A series. Small venues. No critics. Just music for people who need it. Hospitals, community centers, schools. You and me, playing together. She almost laughed. You touring community centers? Why not, he said. I've played for kings and billionaires. Maybe it's time I played for someone who actually needs to hear it. She thought about it. Thought about her mother, who used to say music was medicine for the soul. Thought about the kids in underfunded schools who'd never hear a live piano unless someone brought it to them. Okay, she said, but only if we keep it quiet, no press. No fanfare, no deal. They started planning right away. He used his connections to secure small halls and community spaces. She reached out to local teachers, arranged transportation, even designed simple programs with notes about each piece. It wasn't glamorous. It was real. Their first stop was a children's hospital. They played in the sunroom, surrounded by kids in wheelchairs and parents with tired eyes. She chose simple melodies. For Elise, a lullaby by Grieg, a cheerful Schumann piece. He played along, adding harmonies, making it feel like a conversation. Afterward, a little boy in a hospital gown tugged her sleeve. "Can I touch the piano?" She lifted him onto the bench and guided his small hands over the keys. He giggled as the notes rang out. His mother cried quietly in the corner. Later, as they packed up, he said, "That was the best performance I've ever given." She smiled. Me too. Word spread slowly, not through headlines but through whispers. A teacher told a friend. A nurse mentioned it to a neighbor. Soon they were getting requests from shelters, senior homes, even a refugee center on the edge of the city. At each stop, they played not as stars, but as people. She'd kneel beside a shy teenager and show her how to play a scale. He'd let an elderly man try a chord progression he'd loved as a boy. Music became a bridge, not a barrier, but the more they gave, the more the outside world tried to pull them back into its noise. It started with a blog post. A music journalist who'd heard rumors about the legendary pianist disappearing with a mystery woman from the festival. The article was titled, "Has the Maestro Lost His Mind? Inside His Secret Duets with an Unknown Pianist." It painted her as an opportunist, a nobody using his fame to launch her own career. It dredged up old conservatory records, hinted at a scandalous exit, and questioned why someone of his stature would waste time on amateur hour. She read it once and closed her laptop. Her hands shook, he called that night. "Did you see it?" "Yes. I'm sorry. I should have been more careful." "It's not your fault," she said softly. "But this..." "It's going to scare people off. The centers, the schools, they won't want controversy. They'll see the truth," he said firmly. "But will they?" she asked. "Or will they just see a headline?" The next day, the refugee center canceled. Then a senior home. Then a school. Not because they doubted her, but because they couldn't risk the attention. She wanted to quit. To disappear again, back into the quiet life where no one expected anything of her. But he wouldn't let her. He showed up at her door with 2 coffees and a folder. "I've been digging," he said. "I found your old professor. The one who broke you," she stiffened. "Why?" "Because it's time someone told the truth." He handed her a letter, typed on official conservatory letterhead, signed by 3 former students, including a now famous violinist. It detailed the professor's pattern of emotional abuse, unrealistic demands, and public shaming. It confirmed everything she'd lived through and more. "He's been quietly removed from teaching," he said. "And I've shared this with the right people. The narrative is changing." She read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. Not from pain, but from relief. For the first time, she wasn't alone in her story. That evening, they played at a small community center that hadn't canceled. Just 20 people in folding chairs. She played the Chopin Nocturne. Alone this time. Not for critics, not for headlines. for the woman in the back row who closed her eyes and mouthed the melody like she knew it by heart. Afterward, the center's director hugged her. "Don't stop," she whispered. "The world needs this," she didn't answer. But as she walked out into the night hand in hand with him, she knew she wouldn't. Because music wasn't about fame. It wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up even when you're scared. Even when the world tries to tell you you don't belong. And for the first time, she was ready to keep showing up. The quiet momentum they'd built began to feel like solid ground. After the letter from the conservatory surfaced, the tone of the conversation shifted. A few music blogs published follow-ups, this time with empathy, not suspicion. A respected critic even wrote a piece titled, "The Cost of Genius: Why We Must Protect the Quiet Voices." It didn't go viral, but it reached the right people. The community centers that had canceled started calling back, apologizing, asking if they'd still come. She said yes. They played in a converted church basement where the piano was slightly out of tune, but the audience sang along to the folk melodies. They played in a youth shelter where a teenage girl stayed after to ask how to play just one song for her little brother. They played in a senior home where an old man with dementia tapped his foot the entire time, and his daughter whispered, "He hasn't moved like that in months." Each performance was small, imperfect, deeply human, and with every note she felt herself stitching back together. Not the prodigy she'd been, but the woman she'd become. He, too, seemed lighter. He stopped checking his phone during rehearsals. He laughed more, real laughs, not the polished ones he used for interviews. One afternoon, as they packed up after a school visit, he said, "I think I forgot how much I loved this. Not the fame, just the sharing." She smiled. Music was never meant to be locked behind velvet ropes. No, he agreed. It was meant to be passed hand to hand like bread. But just as they began to believe the storm had passed, a new one gathered on the horizon. It started with an email. She was at home, grading simple theory worksheets for a local music outreach program, when her inbox pinged. The subject line read, "We know who you really are." Her stomach dropped. She almost deleted it, but curiosity, or maybe dread, made her click. Inside was a scanned copy of an old hospital bill from 10 years ago, her mother's name, her address at the time, and a handwritten note in the margin. Payment declined. Patient discharged against medical advice. Attached was a second document, a conservatory disciplinary report, heavily redacted, but clearly referencing her unauthorized absence and failure to meet performance standards. At the bottom, a single line. "You think you've fooled him, but the world remembers." She sat very still. Her hands went cold. This wasn't speculation. This was someone who dug deep, into medical records, into sealed school files. Someone with access. Someone who wanted her gone. She didn't tell him right away. She stuffed the email into a folder and went to bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the building sounded like a threat. Every shadow felt like a warning. The next morning, he called. "You okay?" "You seem quiet." "I'm fine," she said, voice tight. He didn't push, but he knew. That afternoon, as they rehearsed in the practice hall, he stopped mid-phrase. "Talk to me." She hesitated. Then she pulled out her phone and showed him the email. He read it slowly, his expression darkening. When he looked up, his eyes were sharp, focused, not angry, but determined. "This isn't random. Someone's targeting you." "Who would do this?" He paced the small room, running a hand through his hair. "My manager has been furious since I canceled the tour. He thinks I'm throwing away my legacy for a sentimental hobby." He paused. "But this feels personal." She wrapped her arms around herself. "What if they leak it? What if it gets worse?" "They won't," he said firmly, "because I'm not letting them." Before she could respond, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Not to his publicist, not to his lawyer, to a retired investigator, a former police officer who now worked discreetly for artists and diplomats. "I need you to find out who's behind this," he said, quietly, quickly. She wanted to protest, to say it wasn't worth the trouble. But the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't about protecting his reputation. It was about protecting her. 2 days later, the investigator called back. It wasn't the manager. It was someone closer, a former student of the abusive professor, the one who'd been removed from the conservatory. He'd built a small but vocal online following, positioning himself as a defender of classical standards. He saw her return not as redemption, but as a threat to the purity of the art form. He believed she'd fabricated her injury to escape accountability, and now she was using the legendary pianist for fame. Worse, he'd contacted several major music publications with evidence of her deception. He's planning to publish a full exposé tomorrow, the investigator said. Photos, documents, even old voice recordings from conservatory critiques. She felt sick. What do we do? That night, instead of rehearsing, they met in the practice hall with the investigator and a trusted journalist, a woman known for ethical reporting and deep integrity. They laid out everything: the medical records, the conservatory letter, the timeline of her mother's illness, even bank statements showing years of odd jobs to cover bills. The journalist listened without judgment. Then she said, "If I publish your side first with proof, it takes away his power. But you'll have to go public fully." She looked at him. "I don't want this to be about me." "It already is," he said gently. "But it doesn't have to be about shame. It can be about truth." She thought about the kids at the shelter who'd asked for her autograph. The elderly woman who'd said her playing brought back her husband. The little boy at the hospital who'd giggled at the sound of the piano. This wasn't just her story anymore. "Okay," she said. The next morning, before the exposé could drop, a new article appeared in a respected cultural magazine, titled "The Truth Behind the Silence." It told her story in full, with documents, with dates, with dignity. It didn't ask for pity, it asked for understanding. By noon, the narrative had flipped. The would-be exposé still came out, but it was drowned out by support. Musicians she'd never met posted messages of solidarity. Former classmates shared their own stories of pressure and pain. Even the conservatory issued a public apology. But the real victory wasn't online. It was that afternoon, when a school they'd played at weeks ago sent a video. 20 children playing a simple duet they'd taught them, recorded in their music room dedicated to her. She watched it 3 times, tears streaming down her face. He found her in the practice hall that evening, sitting at the piano, not playing, just resting her hands on the keys. "They saw you," he said softly. She nodded. "Not the scandal, not the past, just me." He sat beside her. "You know what my grandmother used to say? The strongest music isn't the loudest. It's the one that keeps playing after the world tries to silence it." She looked at him. "I think I'm ready to keep playing." He smiled. "Then let's give them something worth listening to." And for the first time, she didn't just believe she belonged in the music world. She knew she always had. The truth, once spoken, has a way of clearing the air. After the article went public, the noise didn't vanish overnight, but it changed. The angry comments slowed. The rumors lost their teeth. And something unexpected happened. People started reaching out not with suspicion, but with stories of their own. A young violinist wrote to say she'd almost quit after a harsh critique. But reading about the journey gave her courage to keep going. A retired teacher shared how she'd hidden her love of piano for decades, afraid she wasn't good enough. Even a few former conservatory students contacted her privately, thanking her for giving them permission to speak their own truths. She didn't reply to all of them. But she read every message, and for the first time she didn't feel like an imposter in the world of music. She felt like part of a quiet, resilient chorus. People who loved the art more than the applause. He noticed the shift in her. Not just in her playing, though that had grown freer, bolder, but in the way she carried herself. She no longer ducked her head when entering a room. She met people's eyes. She even started accepting small invitations to speak at music workshops, not as a star, but as someone who'd walked through fire and kept playing. One rainy afternoon, as they rehearsed in the practice hall, he stopped mid-phrase and said, "I've been thinking. We've been playing for others. What if we made something just for us?" She looked up from the keys. "Like what?" "A recording. Not for labels. Not for charts, just a document of this time. Of us." She hesitated. "I've never recorded anything. Neither have I, not like this. No edits, no retakes. Just 2 pianos and the truth." She thought about it. Thought about the hours they'd spent in this room. The mistakes they'd laughed off. The silences that spoke louder than notes. "Okay," she said. "But only if we do it somewhere quiet. Somewhere that feels like home." He smiled. "I know just the place." 2 weeks later, they drove to a small village in the Austrian countryside, a place he'd visited as a child, where his grandmother once played piano in the local church. The building was old but well kept, its wooden pews worn smooth by generations. In the corner stood a modest Steinway tuned just for them. No audience, no microphones visible. Just two pianos, a sound engineer they trusted, and the soft hum of the countryside outside. They began with the Mozart duet they'd played at the chapel, the one that started it all. Then Schubert. Then the Chopin Nocturne, now woven into a conversation between two voices that had learned to listen. It wasn't perfect. A bird chirped outside during a quiet passage. She missed a note in the third movement. He rushed to transition, but they didn't stop. They kept going because that's what real music does. It breathes. It stumbles. It rises again. On the third day, as the sun set through the stained glass windows, casting colored light across the floor, he handed her a sheet of music he'd been working on in secret. "I wrote this for you," he said. She read it slowly. It was a duet, simple, tender, built around a melody that felt like a question and an answer at the same time. At the top, in his careful handwriting, "For the one who never really left." She didn't speak. She just sat at the piano and played it. He joined in on the second verse. When they finished, the sound engineer, who'd been silent the whole time, wiped his eyes and said, "That's the most honest thing I've ever recorded." They didn't plan to release it widely, but when they played a rough cut for a few close friends, one of them, a music teacher from a community school, asked, "Can we share this with our students?" Not as a lesson in technique, as a lesson in courage. They agreed. Within weeks, the recording, titled simply "Together," began circulating quietly among music educators, youth programs, even therapy centers. No marketing, no promotion, just word of mouth. A teacher in Berlin used it to help a student overcome performance anxiety. A hospital in Prague played it in their palliative care unit. A refugee camp in Greece included it in their weekly music hour. It wasn't famous, but it was needed. Back in Vienna, life settled into a new rhythm. She still coordinated small arts events, but now she also taught weekly classes at a community center, free of charge, open to anyone who showed up. He still performed occasionally, but only pieces that meant something to him, and always with a portion of the proceeds going to music access programs. One evening, as they walked home from the practice hall, she said, "I used to think music was something you had to earn, like you had to prove you deserved it." He glanced at her. "And now? Now I think it's something you give, and in giving it you find it again." He nodded. "My grandmother used to say the best music isn't the kind that fills concert halls. It's the kind that fills empty spaces, with hope, with memory, with connection." She smiled. "She sounds like she knew what mattered." "She did," he said. "And so do you." They didn't talk about the future in grand terms. No talk of world tours or record deals. Just small plans. A performance at a children's hospital next month. A workshop for teen musicians. Maybe even starting a small scholarship for students from underfunded schools. But the biggest change wasn't in what they did. It was in how they saw themselves. She was no longer the woman who'd walked away. He was no longer the legend chasing perfection. They were just two people who'd found each other in the silence between the notes and decided to keep playing. And in that choice, they'd already won. The invitation came on a crisp autumn morning, slipped into her mailbox with no return address, just a simple cream envelope with elegant handwriting. Inside was a single card. "You are cordially invited to perform at the Golden Hall of the Musikverein, a private evening for those who listen with their hearts." At the bottom, in smaller print, no press, no recordings, just music. She stared at it for a long time. The Musikverein, the very place where it had all begun, the joke, the silence, the stunned crowd. The thought of returning there, not as staff but as a performer, sent a wave of nerves through her. But beneath the fear was something else, readiness. He'd arranged it, of course. Not as a grand comeback, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet homecoming. He'd convinced the hall's director, a longtime friend, to open the space for one night, for an audience of 50. Music teachers, community leaders, students from the programs they'd visited, a few former critics who'd once doubted her, and the elderly conductor who'd bowed that first night. No expectations, he'd told her when he called. Just play what feels true. She spent the next 2 weeks preparing, not practicing endlessly, but listening. She played through pieces she loved, discarding those that felt showy, keeping only the ones that carried meaning. She chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, not for its difficulty, but for its depth. It was a piece about darkness and light, about despair and resilience. It felt honest. The night of the concert, she arrived early, dressed in a simple dark dress, her hair loose for the first time in years. The Golden Hall was breathtaking. Gilded walls, velvet seats, the famous acoustics that made every note feel like it was wrapped in gold. But she didn't feel small. She felt seen. He met her backstage, calm and steady. Nervous? A little. Good, he said, smiling. That means you care. They didn't speak much after that. There was no need. They'd said everything in rehearsals, in late-night talks, in the quiet understanding that had grown between them. When it was time, she walked onto the stage alone. No introduction, no applause. Just her, the piano, and a room full of people who'd come not for fame, but for feeling. She sat, took a breath, and began. The first chords of the Rachmaninoff rolled out like thunder, deep, resonant, full of storm. But as the piece unfolded, it wasn't just power she gave it. It was vulnerability. In the quiet passages, she let the notes hang like unanswered prayers. In the climaxes, she didn't just play loudly. She played with truth, with every loss, every hope, every silent year she'd carried inside. Halfway through, her right hand trembled, the old injury whispering its warning. For a split second, she faltered, but she didn't stop. She leaned into the imperfection, let it become part of the story, because that's what life was, messy, uncertain, beautiful anyway. When the final chord faded, the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Then, slowly, the elderly conductor stood. Not to clap, but to bow, just as he had that first night. One by one, others followed. Not with cheers, but with reverence. A young girl in the front row wiped her eyes. A music teacher held her student's hand tightly. Even the critics sat still, as if afraid to break the spell. Afterward, in the quiet hum of the emptying hall, a woman approached her. She was in her 70s, eyes bright with tears. "My husband played this piece for me on our wedding night," she said softly. "He passed last year, tonight." It felt like he was here again. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and squeezed the woman's hand. Later, as they walked out into the cool night air, he turned to her. "You didn't just play a piece tonight. You gave people back a memory." She looked up at the stars. "I just played what I felt." That's the rarest thing of all. They didn't go to a fancy dinner. They went to a small cafe down the street, the kind with mismatched chairs and strong coffee. They sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. "I used to think performing was about proving something," she said after a while. "Now I think it's about sharing something." He nodded. "Music isn't a competition. It's a conversation," she smiled. And tonight people listened. Back at her apartment, she didn't sleep right away. She sat at her old upright piano, the one with the slightly sticky E key, and played the Rachmaninoff again softly, just for herself. This time there was no audience, no pressure, no past to outrun. Just her and the music finally at peace. The next morning, a package arrived at the community center where she taught. Inside was a framed photo from the concert. Her at the piano, eyes closed, lost in the music. On the back, a note in his handwriting, "Not a comeback. A continuation." She hung it in the practice room where her students could see it. That afternoon, a shy boy of 10 came in for his lesson. He'd been struggling with confidence, always afraid of making mistakes. He saw the photo and asked, "Is that you?" She nodded. "Did you ever mess up?" "Every day," she said. "But I kept playing." He thought about that. Then he sat at the piano and played his scales, slowly, carefully, without fear. And in that moment she knew. This was why she'd returned. Not for the stage, not for the applause, but for this, for the quiet ripple of courage passing from one heart to another. Later that week he called. "There's a school in the mountains that's never had a live piano performance." They asked if we'd come. She didn't hesitate. "When do we leave?" Because the music wasn't finished. It never would be. As long as there were people who needed to hear it, who needed to feel it, who needed to believe they weren't alone, it would keep playing, and she would keep playing with it. Years passed. Not with fanfare, but with small, steady moments. the kind that don't make headlines but build a life. The Music Verein concert became a quiet legend in certain circles, not for its brilliance but for its honesty. She never became a global star. She turned down record deals, declined invitations to international festivals, and politely ignored agents who promised fame. Instead, she kept teaching at the community center, now expanded into a modest nonprofit with a proper name. The Open Key Project, a place where anyone, regardless of background or ability, could learn music without fear. He, too, changed his path. He still performed, but only when it meant something. Benefits for music education, intimate recitals in underserved towns, collaborations with young artists no one else would take a chance on. He used his influence not to climb higher, but to lift others up. And every Tuesday and Friday, without fail, he showed up at the practice hall on Berggasse, not as a legend but as a friend. They never made grand declarations. There were no press releases, no staged photos. But over time, people noticed. They traveled together, shared an apartment above the community center, and always played duets at the end of the year recital. It wasn't romance in the way movies show it. It was partnership, built note by note, silence by silence, choice by choice. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms drifted past the windows of the practice hall, he handed her a sheet of music. It was handwritten, slightly smudged, with coffee stains in the corner. At the top, in his familiar script, "For the one who taught me to listen." She read through it slowly. It was a duet, gentle, spacious, full of room for both voices to speak and respond. In the middle, a passage echoed the Chopin nocturne they'd first played together but transformed. Lighter, freer, like a memory that had finally found peace. "What's this for?" she asked. He smiled. "For tonight." That evening, the community center hosted its annual spring recital. The room was packed, not with critics or donors, but with families, students, neighbors, and a few elderly patrons who'd been coming for years. Children played scales with proud concentration. Teenagers performed pieces they'd chosen themselves, some classical, some pop, one even a song they'd written about their dog. When it was time for the final performance, they walked on stage together, not in formal wear, but in simple clothes like everyone else. No introduction, no spotlight. Just two pianos and two people who'd learned that music wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. They began to play. His part was steady, grounding, like a hand reaching out in the dark. Hers rose above it, clear and strong, like a voice that had finally found its song. They didn't play flawlessly. He rushed a transition. She missed a chord. But they listened to each other, adjusted, stayed together, and in that imperfection, there was something more beautiful than any flawless performance: trust. When the last note faded, the room didn't erupt in applause. They just sat in quiet reverence, as if they'd been let in on something sacred. Then slowly a little girl in the front row stood up and clapped. Others joined, parents, teachers, students, until the whole room was filled with warm, steady applause. Not for fame, not for technique, but for truth. Afterward, as they packed up, a young man approached her. He'd been one of her first students, a shy teenager from a refugee family who'd barely spoken English when he started. Now he was studying music at university. "You changed my life," he said simply. She shook her head. "You changed your own. I just handed you the keys," he smiled. "Still, thank you." Later, as they walked home under a sky streaked with sunset, he stopped beneath the old chestnut tree where they'd sat that first night after the Music Verein reception. Both lost, both hurting, neither knowing what would come next. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made that joke?" he asked. She looked at him. "I used to. But now I think maybe it wasn't the joke that mattered. Maybe it was what came after. The listening, the showing up, the choosing to believe in each other." He nodded. "I thought I was giving you a chance that night. But really, you gave me one." They stood in silence for a while, watching the city lights flicker on below. The world kept spinning. Headlines came and went, trends rose and fell, fame faded. But here, in this quiet corner of Vienna, something real had taken root. Back at the apartment, she placed the new duet on the piano stand. He made tea, and without a word, they sat down and played it again, just for themselves, just for the joy of it. In the years that followed, they never stopped. They played in schools and hospitals and village halls across the countryside. They mentored young musicians, funded scholarships, and kept the community center open through grants and small donations. They never sought the spotlight, but their music reached farther than either of them imagined, not because it was perfect, but because it was human. And sometimes on quiet Sunday mornings, visitors to the practice hall on Berggasse would hear two pianos playing through the open window, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in playful disagreement. Always together, people would stop, listen for a moment, and walk on with a little more hope in their step, because the most stunning things in life aren't the grand gestures or the flawless performances. They're the quiet choices to keep showing up, to keep playing even when the world tries to silence you, and in that choice they found everything.